5 boys, 1 park, 1 night that would change their lives forever. In the spring of 1989, New York City became a stage for one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in American history. They were just kids, 14, 15, 16 years old, with hopes, with families, with dreams. But within hours, their names would be dragged across headlines as monsters, predators, a so-called wolf pack. What happened in Central Park on April 19th was tragic. But what followed was catastrophic. This is the story of the Central Park Five, later known as the Exonerated Five. April in New York carries its own kind of magic. The cold bite of winter has loosened, replaced with warm breezes drifting through Central Park. Joggers fill the paths. Families gather by the lakes. Teenagers, restless and energetic, find themselves pulled to the park after school, chasing laughter, freedom, and a place to belong. It was April 19th, 1989, a Wednesday evening. The city, like always, was alive. A hum of traffic, neon signs flickering, the chatter of thousands moving through Manhattan. For the boys who would soon be known as the Central Park Five, it was just another night. Antron McCray, 15 years old, loved baseball. Quiet, thoughtful, he was the kind of kid who looked up to his father and wanted nothing more than to make him proud. Kevin Richardson, 14, was funny, lighthearted, and carried his trumpet everywhere. He dreamed of one day playing music professionally. Yusef Salaam, 15, was already deeply spiritual, thoughtful beyond his years, shaped by his mother's strong guidance. Raymond Santana, 14, loved drawing, sketching graffiti-style art that gave him a sense of freedom. And Korey Wise, the oldest at 16, a gentle soul who had learning difficulties, who wasn't even originally part of the group heading into the park that night. He was a loyal friend who tagged along because Yusef didn't want to go alone. They were kids, not saints, not troublemakers, just boys, navigating adolescence in Harlem and the Bronx. At the same time those boys laughed and wandered into the park, another life intersected their path. Trisha Meili, a 28-year-old investment banker, was jogging her usual route through Central Park. She was a driven young professional, known for her discipline, her warmth, and her resilience. That night, she would become the victim of a brutal, almost unimaginable assault. She was beaten, raped, and left for dead, her body hidden in the brush, barely clinging to life. When she was later found, unconscious and covered in blood, doctors weren't sure she would survive. She remained in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. Against all odds, she pulled through, but with permanent injuries that would alter the rest of her life. The crime was shocking, even for a city hardened by violence. In 1989, New York was gripped by fear. Murders were at record highs. Crack cocaine flooded the streets. The public felt under siege. And when the news broke of a young white woman brutally attacked in Central Park, the outrage was immediate and explosive. The assault electrified headlines overnight. New Yorkers demanded justice. They wanted answers fast. Police flooded Central Park, rounding up teenagers who had been in the park that evening. Dozens of boys were questioned. The city buzzed with rumors about groups of wilding teens, a term the press seized upon, sensationalizing it as proof that gangs of Black and Latino boys roamed the park at night looking for victims. It was a stereotype, wrapped in fear, sharpened by racism. And it would soon become the defining narrative of the case. For Antron, Kevin, Yusef, Raymond, and Korey, their lives were about to collide with a system hungry for culprits. What makes this story so devastating is not just the crime itself, but the chain reaction it set off. The boys had no idea, as they walked home from the park that night, that police were already zeroing in on them. They couldn't know that within hours they would be sitting in cramped interrogation rooms, cut off from their parents, fighting exhaustion, confusion, and fear. They couldn't know that soon they would be labeled monsters by headlines, their childhood stolen before their eyes. They were about to be cast in a role they never auditioned for, villains in a story that the city was desperate to tell. And it all began with a single decision. The decision by police to turn suspicion into certainty, to turn frightened kids into the face of New York's rage. As dawn broke over New York on April 20th, police announced they had suspects. 5 boys, plucked from the chaos of that night, accused of one of the most shocking crimes in the city's history. Their faces, once anonymous, were now targets. But how did the system take 5 kids with no evidence against them and build a case that would destroy their lives? That's where our story continues. Imagine being just 14, 15 years old, pulled into a room with no lawyer, no parents, no one to shield you. Hours pass. Lights burn into your eyes. Strangers tell you you're guilty, again and again, until you start to believe it yourself. This is how innocence was broken, not in the park, but in those interrogation rooms. In the early hours of April 20th, police moved quickly. Central Park had been flooded with officers after the jogger was discovered, and any teenager still lingering in the area was swept up. Among them were Kevin Richardson and Raymond Santana. Both boys had been hanging out with other kids in the park. They hadn't seen the attack, hadn't even known it happened. But in the eyes of police, they were part of the wilding group. One by one, the others were pulled in. Antron McCray was called in from home. Yusef Salaam was questioned after being picked up with friends. And Korey Wise, loyal, quiet Korey, wasn't even on the list. He went down to the station simply to keep Yusef company. That decision would alter the course of his life forever. What followed was not ordinary questioning. The boys were teenagers, some barely in high school. None had ever been through anything like this. But the police were under enormous pressure. The crime against Trisha Meili was brutal, and the city demanded answers. Detectives wanted confessions, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get them. The boys were kept awake for hours. They were yelled at, lied to, told stories of each other turning against them. Police painted graphic pictures of the attack, insisting the kids had been involved. Some were struck physically. All were broken down emotionally. There were no parents in the room to protect them, no lawyers to intervene, just frightened boys, exhausted and terrified, caught in a storm they didn't understand. Eventually, under relentless pressure, the boys said what the detectives wanted to hear. Kevin Richardson, barely 14, repeated back fragments detectives had fed him. Antron McCray, scared of his father's disappointment, just wanted it to be over. Raymond Santana, overwhelmed, nodded along to a story that wasn't his. Yusef Salaam resisted the longest, refusing to sign anything that wasn't true. But even his words were twisted, reshaped by police into something they could use. And Korey Wise, the oldest, endured the harshest. Hours turned into the night. His confusion, his fear, his need to please authority, all of it was exploited. Eventually, a shaky statement was coaxed out of him too. The confessions didn't match each other. They contradicted in places. The timeline didn't add up. The details were wrong. But none of that mattered. On videotape, 5 young boys sat in front of cameras and confessed to crimes they hadn't committed. And that, in the eyes of the public, was all it took. The next day, New Yorkers woke up to headlines that screamed of monsters, predators, a wolf pack. The language was dehumanizing. Reporters painted the boys not as children but as animals. Dangerous, savage, a threat to society. Their faces appeared in newspapers, their names broadcast on television. The media frenzy wasn't just about the crime. It was about fear. This was 1989. The city was struggling with record crime. Racial tensions were boiling. Politicians and public figures seized the case as proof that the city was under attack from within. Donald Trump, then a high-profile real estate mogul, paid for full-page ads in 4 New York City newspapers, calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty. Though he didn't name the boys directly, the message was clear. Someone had to pay. And for the public, the 5 teenagers became the face of their rage. Behind the headlines, 5 families were breaking. Parents who had sent their kids to the park never imagined they'd be accused of a crime like this. The McCrays, the Richardsons, the Salams, the Santanas, the Wises, ordinary families from Harlem and the Bronx, suddenly found themselves thrust into a nightmare. Mothers wept in courtrooms. Fathers tried to fight for their sons, only to watch them disappear into a system they couldn't stop. Siblings faced ridicule at school. Families were harassed in their neighborhoods. The boys weren't just losing their freedom. Their families were losing their reputations, their livelihoods, their peace. Before the trial even began, the boys were convicted in the court of public opinion. Their coerced confessions were broadcast on TV. The contradictions and lack of physical evidence were buried beneath sensational headlines. The city didn't want nuance. It didn't want to hear that the DNA evidence from the crime scene didn't match any of them. It didn't want to hear that the timelines didn't line up. The city wanted closure, and closure meant guilt. 5 boys, stripped of their childhoods, had been transformed into villains for a city hungry for justice. The machine was in motion now, unstoppable. Next came the trials, and for Antron, Kevin, Yusef, Raymond, and Korey, the nightmare was only beginning. The confessions were shaky, the evidence was weak, but the machinery of justice was already in motion. 5 boys, barely teenagers, were about to face the full weight of the state. The trial wasn't about truth. It was about winning, and in that contest, innocence didn't stand a chance. By the summer of 1990, the case of the Central Park Jogger was everywhere. The attack on Trisha Meili had horrified the city, and the arrests of the 5 boys had given the public someone to blame. Now, in a Manhattan courtroom, the state was determined to seal the case. The courtroom was packed with reporters. The atmosphere was tense, electric. Families sat on hard benches, clutching hope that the truth would finally be heard. But almost immediately, it was clear the deck was stacked against the boys. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the videotaped confessions. Jurors watched as Kevin, Antron, Raymond, Yusef, and Korey, their voices shaking, told stories of being in the park that night. The fact that those stories contradicted each other didn't matter. The fact that none of the details matched the crime scene didn't matter. The confessions were emotional, and emotion outweighed fact. The defense fought to highlight the holes in the case. There was no DNA evidence linking the boys to the crime. The semen found inside Trisha Meili didn't match any of them. No fingerprints, no blood, no physical tie. But prosecutors reframed the story. They argued that even if the DNA came from someone else, the boys were still guilty of participating in the assault. They painted a picture of a chaotic gang attack where not everyone left behind evidence, but all were responsible. It was a narrative designed to fill the gaps with fear, and it worked. For the parents, watching their children in court was agony. They saw them not as defendants, but as the kids they raised. Kids who still loved cartoons, still dreamed about sports, still relied on their families for protection. Antron McCray's father, overwhelmed and pressured, had once urged his son to confess, believing it would lessen his punishment. In court, the weight of that decision crushed him. He sat in silence, watching his boy fight for his life. Korey Wise's family felt especially powerless. Korey, at 16, was being tried as an adult. He was facing not only longer sentences but also adult prison, a place far more dangerous than any juvenile facility. His mother, already struggling, could barely face the thought of what awaited him. In 1990 and 1991, the verdicts came. One by one, the boys were convicted. Charges included assault, rape, robbery, and riot. Antron, Kevin, Yusef, and Raymond, all under 16, were sentenced to serve between 5 and 10 years in juvenile facilities. Korey Wise, the oldest, was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in adult prison. The gavel came down, and with it, their childhoods ended. Prison was a brutal awakening. For the younger boys, Antron, Kevin, Yusef, and Raymond, the juvenile system was harsh, but it still offered glimpses of rehabilitation. They clung to hope, to family visits, to the thought that one day they would be free. But for Korey Wise, the reality was far darker. At Rikers Island and later in maximum security prisons, Korey endured the full brutality of the adult system. He was beaten by other inmates. Guards targeted him. He spent years in solitary confinement, isolated in a cell barely larger than a closet, his mind unraveling in the silence. Korey wasn't just serving time for a crime he didn't commit. He was enduring a punishment no teenager should ever face. His resilience, his sheer will to survive, would later become a central piece of this story. But in those years, it nearly broke him. Back home, the families carried their own sentences. Mothers worked multiple jobs to pay legal fees. Fathers battled shame and guilt. Siblings were bullied in school. The stigma of being connected to the Central Park Five never faded. The boys missed birthdays, graduations, first loves. They watched their peers move forward in life while they remained trapped in a nightmare. As the years passed, New York City changed. The crime wave of the late 80s began to ebb. The public's rage cooled. The Central Park case, once the headline of every paper, faded into the background. But for the five boys, now young men, the consequences were permanent. They carried the weight of a conviction that branded them as rapists, predators, criminals. No matter how many times they insisted on their innocence, the world didn't listen. The truth, it seemed, had been buried for good. Years passed. The boys became men behind bars. Hope dimmed. And then, just when the story seemed over, a chance encounter inside a prison yard would unravel everything. A stranger's confession, a match in the DNA, and the revelation that the real rapist had been free all along. By the late 1990s, the Central Park Five were shadows of the boys they once were. Their names had been dragged through headlines, their futures stolen. But in the shadows of prison yards and forgotten files, the real story was waiting to be discovered. And when it surfaced, it shattered everything we thought we knew. Even after the verdicts, unease lingered in the case. Lawyers, activists, and even some journalists quietly questioned the narrative. How could five boys with no matching DNA be guilty of a crime so violent, so precise? But those doubts never reached the mainstream. The city had moved on and the wolf pack label stuck. To challenge the story was to challenge the system itself, and few were willing to risk that. Yet behind prison walls, one man's conscience was stirring. In 2002, more than a decade after the attack, Korey Wise, still incarcerated, encountered a fellow inmate named Matias Reyes. Reyes was serving time for multiple brutal rapes and a murder. Unlike the five, Reyes had a long documented history of sexual violence. The two men crossed paths in the yard, and in a twist no one could have scripted, Reyes recognized Korey. He knew why Korey was in prison, and it ate at him, because Reyes wasn't just another inmate. He was the real attacker. He was the man who assaulted Trisha Meili that night in 1989. Reyes could have stayed silent. His crimes had already doomed him to life in prison. But something, guilt, faith, fate, pushed him to confess. In 2002, he told authorities he alone had attacked Trisha Meili. He acted alone. The boys had nothing to do with it. At first, his confession sounded unbelievable. After all, why would a convicted rapist suddenly take responsibility for one of the most infamous crimes in New York history? But then the DNA told the story. Investigators tested Reyes's DNA against the evidence from 1989. The result was undeniable. A perfect match. The semen found in Trisha Meili belonged to him, and only him. The truth had been sitting in cold storage for over a decade, waiting for someone to connect the dots. And now, the entire case against the Central Park Five was collapsing. But the revelation raised deeper, darker questions. Why had the case gone so wrong in the first place? The answer lay in a toxic mix of racism, fear, and prosecutorial ambition. The boys weren't seen as children. They were cast as predators. The press fueled hysteria with terms like wolf pack and wilding, words that dehumanized them, stripping away innocence before they ever saw a jury. Detectives pushed confessions because they needed a win, because the city demanded justice. Prosecutors built their case on contradictions because the truth was less important than securing a conviction. And once the boys were convicted, no one in power wanted to admit the system had failed. For over a decade, the truth was buried under pride, politics, and prejudice. By 2002, the boys were no longer boys. They had served their time. Some were out, struggling to rebuild their lives under the weight of sex offender labels. Others were still behind bars. But when Reyes confessed, the pain of the past came rushing back. Could this be real? Could someone finally be listening? For Korey, who had endured the worst of prison life, the confession was both vindication and torment. Vindication because he had always told the truth. Torment because it took 13 years for anyone to believe him. District Attorney Robert Morgenthau ordered a full reinvestigation. The confessions of the 5 boys were scrutinized, and for the first time, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Each boy had given a different version of the crime. None of their stories matched the crime scene. Their confessions, once paraded as proof, now looked like exactly what the defense had always said: coerced, manipulated, and false. In December 2002, the convictions of the Central Park Five were formally vacated. After more than a decade, they were finally free, not just in body but in name. The news sent shockwaves through New York. Some people were outraged, demanding to know how justice had gone so wrong. Others struggled to let go of the narrative they had believed for years. But one thing was undeniable: the Central Park Five had been innocent all along. They weren't predators. They weren't monsters. They were kids. Kids who had been swallowed whole by a system designed to see them as guilty from the start. The boys were exonerated, their names cleared, but freedom didn't erase the scars. After years stolen, how do you rebuild a life? And how does a city, a nation, face the truth that it condemned 5 children while the real rapist walked free? They had been branded monsters. They had been caged as criminals. But in 2002, the truth broke through. The Central Park Five were innocent. Yet freedom, after years lost, is never simple. The story didn't end with exoneration. It was only the beginning. December 19, 2002. A courtroom in Manhattan fell silent as the judge vacated the convictions of Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Korey Wise. For more than a decade, they had lived with the weight of being rapists in the public eye. Now, the legal system finally admitted its mistake. There were tears, embraces, and disbelief, but also an overwhelming question: what now? Freedom didn't erase the damage. By 2002, the boys were men, hardened by prison, their youth stolen. Antron McCray, once a shy teenager who dreamed of playing baseball, struggled with bitterness. He had been broken by the system, his trust shattered. Kevin Richardson, who loved the trumpet, carried the stigma of a false conviction that had robbed him of music and innocence. Yusef Salaam, poetic and spiritual, leaned on faith to find strength, but the years lost haunted him. Raymond Santana, who went in at just 14, found himself re-entering a world that had passed him by, his teenage years stolen. Korey Wise, the eldest and most punished, had endured adult prison. He had lived through horrors the others never faced, simply because he was tried as an adult. His scars, both seen and unseen, were deep. They were free men, yes, but the system had left wounds that would never fully heal. In 2003, the men filed a civil rights lawsuit against New York City, demanding accountability for their wrongful convictions. The case dragged on for over a decade. The city resisted, unwilling to admit full responsibility for its role in destroying 5 young lives. But in 2014, justice arrived, though late. New York City agreed to a $41 million settlement, about $1 million for each year they had spent imprisoned. It was one of the largest settlements for wrongful conviction in U.S. history. For the Exonerated Five, the money could never buy back their lost childhoods, their stolen years. But it was recognition, a statement that the city had been wrong. Through it all, there was also the story of Trisha Meili, the Central Park Jogger. Against all odds, she survived the brutal attack that left her in a coma for 12 days. Her courage to rebuild her life, to step forward and reclaim her identity, remains extraordinary. She later revealed her name to the public and became an author and inspirational speaker, sharing her journey of survival. Her resilience stands alongside the Exonerated Five struggle, 2 lives forever changed by one night in 1989. For years, the Exonerated Five lived in the shadow of their wrongful convictions. But in 2019, their story reached a new generation through Ava DuVernay's Netflix miniseries, When They See Us. The 4-part series peeled back the layers of pain, injustice, and resilience, putting the boys' humanity at the center of the narrative. Millions watched, many for the first time realizing the depth of the injustice. The show sparked outrage, empathy, and calls for accountability. Prosecutors and investigators who had built the case faced renewed scrutiny, their reputations forever tainted. More importantly, the Exonerated Five became global symbols, not of crime, but of survival. Today, the Exonerated Five, Antron, Kevin, Yusef, Raymond, and Korey, are not silent. They speak at schools, universities, and conferences, using their voices to fight against mass incarceration, systemic racism, and wrongful convictions. Yusef Salaam entered politics, later being elected to public office, turning pain into power. Korey Wise created a foundation to support the wrongfully convicted. Raymond, Antron, and Kevin each continue to advocate for justice reform, carrying the weight of their past into the work they do. Their names are no longer synonymous with guilt. They are synonymous with resilience, truth, and the fight for justice. The Central Park Five, now the Exonerated Five, represent more than a single case. Their story is a mirror, reflecting how fear, prejudice, and systemic bias can warp justice. It's a reminder that innocence is not always enough to protect you, especially when you are young, Black, or Latino. It's a reminder of how fragile freedom can be when the truth is ignored. And yet, it is also a story of survival. Despite everything, the Exonerated Five live. They fight. They stand as proof that even after the darkest night, voices silenced can rise again. In 1989, 5 boys were stolen from their families and branded as criminals. In 2002, the truth set them free. But the scars remain, not just on their lives, but on the conscience of a nation. The Central Park Five became the Exonerated Five, and their story will forever remind us that justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is justice that costs more than anyone should ever have to pay.